Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Consciousness all the way down. There is a view so strange, so counterintuitive, so apparently absurd that most philosophers dismiss it without argument. The view that consciousness is not something that emerges in complex biological systems, but is fundamental to reality itself, that electrons have experience, that atoms feel, that rocks possess some primitive form of awareness. And this view is called panpsychism, and it has been held by philosophers from the pre-Socratics through Leibniz and Spinoza to contemporary thinkers who argue that panpsychism is not absurd but necessary, not a failure of reason, but the only solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The only way to explain how subjective experience arises in a physical universe. Because if consciousness is not fundamental, then it must emerge from non-conscious matter. An emergence of this kind seems impossible, seems like magic, seems to violate everything we know about how properties arise from components. And panpsychism avoids this problem by denying the premise, by insisting that consciousness does not emerge because it was there all along, present in some form at every level of reality. And if this seems crazy, it is only because we have inherited assumptions about matter being dead, inert, purely physical, in some narrow sense that excludes experience. But these assumptions are not forced on us by evidence, are not required by physics, are philosophical additions that might be wrong. That might be the source of the hard problem rather than constraints on its solution. The hard problem of consciousness, formulated most clearly by Chalmers, is the problem of explaining why there is something it is like to be a conscious organism, why physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective experience, by qualia, by the felt quality of seeing red or tasting coffee or feeling pain. And this is distinct from the easy problems, the problems of explaining how the brain processes information, how it responds to stimuli, how it controls behavior, because these are problems about function and mechanism, problems that neuroscience can address through standard scientific methods. But the hard problem is different, is about the existence of experience itself, about why the physical processes do not happen in the dark, why there is an inner life, a perspective, a what it is likeness, and no amount of information about neural firing patterns or computational processes seems to explain this, seems to bridge the gap between objective physical description and subjective felt experience. And this explanatory gap has led some philosophers to conclude that consciousness cannot be explained in physical terms, cannot be reduced to brain processes, cannot be naturalized, and this leads either to dualism, the view that consciousness is a separate substance that interacts with matter, or to panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter itself, present at every level, and panpsychism has seemed to many the less radical option, the one that preserves physicalism while acknowledging that physicalism must include consciousness, must expand our conception of what matter is rather than adding a separate mental substance. Nagel argued that the subjective character of experience is not captured by any functional or behavioral or physical description, that there is something it is like to be a bat that, objective science cannot access, that the first-person perspective is irreducible to third-person description, and this does not force dualism, does not require that consciousness be non-physical, but it does require expanding what we mean by physical, recognizing that physics as currently formulated describes only the relational structure of matter, only how things interact and behave, only the extrinsic properties, and it leaves the intrinsic nature of matter unspecified, leaves open what matter is in itself apart from its relations. And this is where panpsychism enters, suggesting that the intrinsic nature of matter is experiential, that what it is like from the inside is consciousness or proto-consciousness, that the same entity can be described from the outside in terms of mass and charge and spin, and from the inside in terms of experience. And these are not two substances, but two aspects of one substance. And this is Russellian monism, the view that physics describes structure and consciousness describes the intrinsic nature that realizes that structure. And this makes consciousness fundamental without making it supernatural, integrates mind into nature without reducing it to mechanism, preserves the insights of both physicalism and the irreducibility of consciousness. But panpsychism faces a devastating objection: the combination problem, the problem of how. Micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences, how the consciousness of electrons and atoms and molecules adds up to the unified consciousness of a human being. Because combination seems impossible, seems to face the same kind of explanatory gap that emergence faces. Because if each particle has its own experience, how do those experiences combine into a single unified experience? Why is there one stream of consciousness associated with a brain rather than trillions of separate micro-consciousnesses? And saying they combine does not explain anything, does not tell us what combination means for consciousness, does not give us any idea of the mechanism or the principles that govern it. And this is the hardest problem for panpsychism, the place where the view seems to fail, seems to offer no advantage over emergence, because combination is just emergence under a different name, is just the same mystery relocated from the relationship between non-conscious matter and consciousness to the relationship between micro-consciousness and macro-consciousness. Goff and others have tried to solve the combination problem by distinguishing different senses of combination, by arguing that phenomenal combination is different from physical combination, that consciousness combines holistically rather than additively, that the right model is not addition where parts contribute independently, but something more organic where parts are transformed by their relations to wholes, where the micro-experiences are modified by being part of a larger system in ways that create genuinely new experiences at the macro level. But critics argue this just pushes the problem back, just replaces the mystery of emergence with the mystery of holistic combination, and we still have no account of how it works. No principles that predict which combinations of micro-experiences produce which macro-experiences. No explanation of why human brains produce unified consciousness, while rocks do not. And without such an account, panpsychism is just a label for the mystery rather than a solution to it. Coleman proposes that combination happens through overlapping wave functions in quantum mechanics, that when particles become entangled, their wave functions overlap, and their experiences blend into a unified experience. And this would give a physical mechanism for phenomenal combination, would explain how micro-experiences unite into macro-experiences through a well-understood physical process. But this proposal faces problems. Problems about whether entanglement really produces the right kind of unity. Problems about whether quantum mechanics applies at the level of neurons and brains, or only at the micro level. Problems about whether experiences can really blend the way wave functions superpose. And most philosophers remain unconvinced, remain skeptical that quantum mechanics solves the combination problem rather than just relocating it to a different domain. The boundary problem is related. the problem of where one conscious subject ends and another begins. Because if consciousness is present at every level, then why is there not one unified cosmic consciousness? Why are there separate subjects at all? Why does my consciousness end at the boundary of my body rather than extending to include everything? And panpsychism seems to have no principled answer, seems to allow for arbitrary boundaries, seems to make the existence of separate subjects as mysterious as the existence of consciousness itself. And this is another way the view fails to explain what it set out to explain. Another place where it encounters problems as hard as the ones it was meant to solve. Leibniz had a version of panpsychism. His monads were simple substances that had perception and appetition, that experienced the world from their own perspective, and he argued that complex beings were aggregates of monads, that each monad mirrored the entire universe from its own point of view, and this avoided the combination problem by denying real combination, by making each monad fundamentally separate, by explaining apparent interaction through pre-established harmony rather than causal connection. But this solution seems even more mysterious than the problem, seems to multiply entities and mechanisms beyond necessity, seems to replace one hard problem with many harder problems, and few contemporary panpsychists follow Leibniz down this path. Few are willing to accept the metaphysical extravagance his system requires. Strawson argues for panpsychism on the grounds that emergence is impossible, that you cannot get something from nothing, that if consciousness exists in the world, then it must have been present in the fundamental constituents of the world, must have been there from the beginning, because otherwise its appearance would be unintelligible, would be brute, would be the kind of emergence that violates the principle that effects must be contained somehow in their causes. And this argument has force, has intuitive appeal, captures the sense that consciousness is too radically different from non-conscious matter to emerge from it. But critics respond that emergence is ubiquitous in nature, that liquidity emerges from molecules that are not liquid, that life emerges from chemistry that is not alive, that many properties of wholes are not properties of parts. And if these emergences are possible, then why not consciousness? Why should consciousness be special? Why should it require fundamentality when other high-level properties do not? And Strawson's response is that consciousness is categorically different, that it is the only thing we know from the inside, that its emergence would not be like the emergence of liquidity, but like the emergence of existence itself. And this cannot emerge because emergence presupposes existence, and consciousness is a kind of existence, is the only kind we directly know, and so it must be fundamental. Tornoni's integrated information theory is sometimes interpreted as supporting panpsychism, because it says that consciousness is identical to integrated information, that any system with sufficient integration of information is conscious to some degree, and this would mean thermostats and atoms, and even individual electrons have tiny amounts of consciousness, have experience proportional to their integrated information, and this seems to support panpsychism, seems to make consciousness ubiquitous, but Tornoni himself resists the panpsychist interpretation, argues that most simple systems have essentially zero integrated information, that consciousness requires a specific kind of information integration that only complex systems like brains achieve. And the debate about whether IIT supports panpsychism turns on technical questions about how to measure integration, about what counts as information, about whether the theory is giving metaphysics or just correlation. And these questions remain unsettled, remain contested, remain another place where intuition and formalism diverge. The idea of proto-consciousness tries to soften panpsychism, tries to make it more palatable by saying that fundamental particles do not have full consciousness, but have some precursor of consciousness, some primitive form of experience that is to full consciousness, as charges to electromagnetism, a property that can give rise to consciousness without being consciousness itself. But this move seems to undermine the whole point of panpsychism, seems to reintroduce the emergence problem at a different level, because now we need to explain how proto-consciousness becomes consciousness, how the primitive forms combine and develop into the rich experiential life of humans. And this is just the hard problem again, just the explanatory gap relocated. And if proto-consciousness can do this, then why cannot non-consciousness do it? Why is proto-consciousness needed at all? And the answer seems to be that proto-consciousness makes emergence less mysterious, makes the gap smaller, but critics argue it just replaces one mystery with two: the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of proto-consciousness. And we are no better off than we started. James believed in a kind of panpsychism, believed in a pluralistic universe of experiences that combined and separated in various ways, believed that consciousness was not confined to brains, but was present wherever there was activity, wherever there was process, wherever there was something happening. And this fit his pragmatist philosophy, his rejection of rigid categories, his emphasis on process and relation over substance. But he never worked out the details, never solved the combination problem, never explained how his mind dust could aggregate into the unified streams of consciousness that characterize human experience. And his view remains more suggestive than systematic, more a gesture toward possibility than a worked-out theory. Whitehead developed an elaborate process philosophy where experience was fundamental, where actual occasions were drops of experience, where reality was constituted by moments of subjective feeling that perished and were superseded by new moments. And this was panpsychist in spirit. Though Whitehead resisted the label, and his system influenced many later philosophers, influenced process theology and ecological philosophy, and anyone who found substance metaphysics inadequate. But it also suffered from obscurity, from technical terminology that made it inaccessible, from a Baroque complexity that seemed disproportionate to the problems it solved. And while Whitehead's insights about process and relation and creativity remain valuable, his full system has few adherents, and his approach to consciousness has not solved the hard problem in ways that convince skeptics. The objection that panpsychism makes consciousness too cheap, too ubiquitous, too divorced from its connection to intelligence and behavior and biological function is answered by panpsychists who distinguish between consciousness and the various functional roles consciousness plays in humans, between bare experience and the kind of sophisticated, self-reflective awareness that humans have. And they argue that simple systems can have simple experiences without having thoughts or beliefs or desires or any of the cognitive machinery that humans possess. That consciousness comes in degrees, that there is a spectrum from the minimal experience of an electron to the rich inner life of a human. And this avoids making rocks intelligent while still allowing them some form of experience. But it also makes the view less testable, less empirical, less connected to anything we can observe or measure, because if consciousness is present everywhere, but only manifests in behavior in complex systems, then how do we know it is there in simple systems? How do we distinguish panpsychism from the claim that it is as if simple systems had experience even though they do not? And this is the problem of panpsychist metaphysics. It makes claims that seem empirically empty, that make no difference to what we observe, that cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by evidence, and this makes many scientists dismiss the view as unscientific, as metaphysical speculation disconnected from empirical inquiry. Yet panpsychism refuses to die, keeps returning, keeps attracting new defenders, and this persistence suggests it is responding to something real, some genuine difficulty in explaining consciousness within a purely mechanistic framework, some intuition that consciousness is too fundamental, too irreducible, too different from everything else, to be just another emergent property like liquidity or temperature. And whether this intuition is trustworthy or misleading, whether it points toward truth or just reflects the limits of human imagination, remains one of the deepest, unresolved questions in philosophy of mind and panpsychism. Despite its problems, despite the combination problem and the boundary problem and all the other difficulties, remains a live option, remains a view that serious philosophers take seriously, remains a possibility that cannot be ruled out by current evidence or argument. And this says something about the state of consciousness studies, about how far we are from understanding what consciousness is, how it arises, why it exists, and whether we will ever have answers that satisfy both our scientific standards and our philosophical intuitions about what makes an explanation adequate. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organization of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, the organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness, that shortens life, and the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present. In the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns. When the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward, unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial, is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible, is not always traceable, because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated. And regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities. And the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations. And the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission. And the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages. And the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into. And the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants, who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples. And the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation, and the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honors the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma, and the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again, the sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain, And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve, and achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free. When probability contradicts intuition, there is a game show, a host, 3 doors, behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat, then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter, says the probability is now 50-50, says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. And when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that 2/3 probability does not disappear, it transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door. So switching gives a 2/3 chance, while staying gives only the original 1/3 chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability. But none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long, and these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents, and as long as priors satisfy the probability, axioms, and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible, and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says. But this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available, and in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency, and this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. And conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way, and by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational. Just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology, remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts, and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modelling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is hard, harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2 because now there are only two prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is, and this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment, and judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts, and this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence, and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers, and these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. The illusion of pure presence. Western philosophy has been obsessed with presence, with the idea that meaning is fully present to consciousness, that words capture thoughts directly, that speech delivers truth immediately. that understanding happens in a moment of transparent access where mind grasps reality without mediation, without delay, without the contamination of signs and symbols. And this obsession runs from Plato through Descartes to Husserl, this dream of pure presence, of meaning that is simply there, fully present, completely accessible, uncontaminated by absence or difference or time. And Derrida spent his career showing that this dream is impossible, that presence is always haunted by absence, that meaning is never fully present, but always deferred, always dependent on what is not there, always structured by difference and delay. And this critique he called the deconstruction of logocentrism, the deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence, the showing that what philosophy took as foundational, what it built everything on, what it never questioned, was actually an illusion, a construction, a denial of what makes meaning possible in the first place. Logocentrism is the privileging of speech over writing, the assumption that spoken language is primary, is closer to thought, is more authentic, is the natural expression of meaning while writing is secondary, is derivative, is a mere representation of speech, a supplement that adds nothing essential, that could be eliminated without loss. And this privilege appears everywhere in philosophy, appears in Plato's suspicion of writing in the Phaedrus, appears in Rousseau's claim that writing corrupts natural speech, appears in Saussure's insistence that linguistics should study speech, not writing, appears in Husserl's phenomenology, where meaning is supposed to be present to consciousness, in the living voice, in the moment of speaking where thought and expression coincide, where there is no gap, no mediation, no absence, just the full presence of meaning to itself. And Derrida argues that this entire structure is based on a mistake, that speech is not privileged, that it depends on the same structures of absence and difference that characterize writing, that the opposition between speech and writing is false, that what philosophy tried to exclude, tried to marginalize, tried to treat as secondary, is actually constitutive, is what makes meaning possible. And recognizing this requires rethinking everything philosophy has assumed about language and meaning and presence. The argument begins with Saussure, who showed that linguistic signs are arbitrary, that the connection between signifier and signified is conventional, not natural, that there is no resemblance between the sound tree and actual trees, that meaning comes not from positive content but from difference, from the fact that tree is not free, is not three, is not any other word, that each sign gets its meaning from its position in a system of differences, from what it is not rather than from what it is. And this means meaning is never simply present in a sign, is never contained in it, is always dependent on absence, on all the other signs that are not present, but that structure, the meaning of this sign through their absence, through the differences that define the system. And if meaning comes from difference, then it comes from what is absent, comes from the traces of other signs, comes from a structure that cannot be present all at once, that exceeds any moment of presence. That means presence is always already contaminated by absence, always already structured by what is not there. Derrida takes this insight further with his concept of difference, spelled with an A instead of an E to mark a difference that cannot be heard in speech, that exists only in writing. And this spelling already undermines the privilege of speech, already shows that writing can mark distinctions, that speech cannot, that writing is not simply a representation of speech, but has its own resources, its own capacities, its own forms of meaning. And difference is a neologism that combines two French verbs, differ a meaning to differ, and differ a meaning to differ. And Derrida uses this to capture the double movement of meaning. Meaning as difference, as we saw in Saussure, meaning comes from signs being different from each other, but also meaning as deferral. Meaning is never fully present because it always refers beyond itself, always points to other signs, always defers its completion, always postpones the full presence that philosophy dreams of. And this deferral is not an accident, not a limitation that could be overcome, but is the structure of meaning itself. Meaning is essentially deferral, is essentially the play of references that never comes to rest, never achieves the self-presence that would end the chain of signification. The trace is another key concept. The trace is what remains of absence, is the mark that one sign leaves in another, is the way every sign is inhabited by what it is not, by all the differences that constitute it, and the trace is neither present nor absent, is the condition of both presence and absence, is what makes presence possible while preventing it from ever being pure. And philosophy has always tried to exclude the trace, tried to achieve pure presence, tried to eliminate mediation, tried to reach a point where thought and reality meet without the interference of signs. But this is impossible because thought is already sign, is already mediation, is already structured by difference and deferral and trace. And the dream of pure presence is the dream of a meaning that is not meaning, of a thought that is not thought, of a consciousness that transcends its own conditions of possibility. And this is why the dream always fails, why philosophy keeps encountering the same problems, why every attempt to ground meaning in presence leads to paradox and aporia, and the recognition that presence depends on what it tried to exclude. Husserl represents the culmination of the metaphysics of presence. His phenomenology tried to describe consciousness as it appears to itself, tried to bracket all questions of external reality and focus on the structures of experience. And he believed that in the living present, in the now of consciousness, meaning was fully present, that intentionality gave consciousness direct access to objects, that the voice was privileged because in speaking I hear myself speak. The signifier and the signified seem to coincide. There is no delay, no gap, no mediation, just the immediate self-presence of meaning. And Derrida's critique shows that even this privileged case depends on difference and deferral, because the now is not atomic, is not indivisible, is always already divided between past and future, between retention and protension, between what just was and what is about to be. And the pure present is impossible, is never experienced, is a theoretical construct that phenomenology posits but never demonstrates. And if the present is divided, then self-presence is divided, then the voice does not deliver unmediated meaning, but is already caught in the play of difference, already structured by trace and deferral, already contaminated by absence. The supplement is Derrida's term for what is supposed to be secondary, but turns out to be essential, what is supposed to add to something complete, but turns out to constitute it. And writing is the supplement to speech in the logocentric tradition. Writing is supposed to represent speech, to add nothing except the convenience of transmission across distance and time, to be a technology that speech could do without. But Derrida shows that speech already has the structure of writing, already involves repetition and difference and absence, already is a system of marks that function through their differences, not their presence. And what this means is that the supplement is not secondary, the supplement is originary. What seems to come after and add to is actually what makes possible what it supplements. And this reversal is characteristic of deconstruction, the showing that what the tradition marginalized as derivative is actually constitutive, that what was excluded as external is actually internal, that the hierarchy must be reversed or rather dissolved, because the terms are not opposed but entangled, and neither is prior to the other. Both depend on structures that exceed them. Rousseau provides Derrida with a key text. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages argues that speech is natural and writing artificial, that speech expresses passion directly while writing is cold and mediated, that the progress of civilization involves the corruption of natural speech by artificial writing, and yet Rousseau's own text undermines this claim, shows writing doing things speech cannot do, shows that even his account of natural speech describes it in terms that apply to writing, describes it as involving representation and difference and absence. And Rousseau himself acknowledges that writing supplements speech, that it is dangerous precisely because it can do what speech does without the presence of the speaker. And this danger reveals that presence was never essential, that meaning can function in the absence of the speaker, that the supplement is not secondary, but reveals the structure of what it supplements. Reveals that speech was always already writing in the broad sense that Derrida gives to writing, the sense of archie-writing, the structure of difference and deferral and trace that makes all meaning possible. Plato's Phaedrus contains the same tension. Socrates tells the story of Theuhi, who invented writing and offered it to the king as a gift that would improve memory, and the king rejected it, saying that writing would destroy memory, would make people dependent on external marks rather than internal knowledge, would substitute dead letters for living speech, and this criticism assumes that living speech is superior, that presence is better than absence, that memory should be internal, not external, but the dialogue itself is written, is a text that preserves Socrates' words in his absence, his writing that does what Socrates claims writing cannot do. And Derrida reads this tension as revealing the impossibility of excluding writing, the impossibility of maintaining the privilege of speech, because even the critique of writing must use writing, must rely on what it criticizes, must depend on the supplement it tries to marginalize. And this is the logic of the supplement. It shows that what is excluded is necessary, that what is denied is constitutive, that the outside is inside, that presence requires absence. The implications of this for philosophy are profound, because philosophy has always sought foundations, has always tried to find something indubitable, something fully present, something that could ground knowledge without itself needing ground. And the Cartesian cogito was supposed to be this, the I think that is present to itself, that cannot doubt itself, that provides certainty. But Derrida shows that even the cogito depends on language, depends on signs, depends on the repeatability of the I that makes it not fully singular, not fully present, because if I is a sign, then it functions only through its repeatability, only through its ability to be used again in different contexts. And this repeatability is what Derrida calls iterability, the essential repeatability of signs. And iterability introduces absence into presence, introduces difference into identity, because if the sign can be repeated, then it can be repeated in my absence, can function without me, can mean without my intending it to mean. And this shows that meaning is not controlled by intention, is not determined by what the speaker or writer means, but exceeds intention, has a life of its own, can be taken up in contexts that were not anticipated, and mean things that were not intended. And this is why deconstruction can find meanings in texts that authors did not intend, can show texts undermining their own claims, can reveal tensions and contradictions that were not deliberate, but that are nonetheless there in the text. And this is not misreading, not imposing meaning on the text, but is close reading, is attention to what the text says beyond what it means to say, is following the logic of the text further than the author followed it. The critique of phonocentrism, the privileging of voice and hearing over other forms of signification, extends the critique of logocentrism, because the voice was privileged precisely because it seemed to offer presence, seemed to allow the speaker to hear themselves speak, and thereby to experience meaning as present to consciousness. But Derrida shows that hearing oneself speak is not immediate, is not self-presence, because the voice must pass through the medium of sound, must be received by the ear, must be processed by the auditory system. And all of this introduces delay, introduces difference, introduces the trace. And the illusion of immediacy is just that, an illusion, a denial of the mediation that actually occurs. And if speech is mediated, then it is no different in principle from writing. Both are systems of marks that function through difference. Both involve absence and deferral. Both depend on structures that exceed presence. And the privilege of speech is revealed as metaphysical prejudice, as commitment to presence that cannot be sustained, as logocentrism. Meaning as deferred implies that meaning is never fully achieved, never complete, never final, because every attempt to state what something means requires more signs, requires more words, requires explanations that themselves require explanation. And this is not a failure, not a lack, but is the condition of meaning. Meaning is essentially open, essentially unfinished, essentially exceeds any attempt to pin it down, and interpretation is therefore infinite. Not because meanings are arbitrary, but because meanings are inexhaustible, because every text can be read in multiple ways, can support multiple interpretations. Not because anything goes, but because the text itself is structured by difference, is itself a play of differences that no single reading can master. And this does not make interpretation hopeless, but makes it necessary, makes it an ongoing task, makes it something that cannot be completed but must be continually undertaken. The political implications are significant because deconstruction reveals that all binary oppositions, all hierarchies, all claims to pure presence or pure identity are unstable, are constructed, are maintained through exclusion and denial. And this applies to oppositions like man/woman, white/non-white, straight/queer, rational/emotional, civilized/primitive, where one term is privileged and the other marginalized. And deconstruction shows that the privileged term depends on what it excludes, that identity depends on difference, that the center requires the margin, and this does not simply reverse the hierarchy, does not simply elevate what was marginalized, but shows that the hierarchy itself is unstable, that both terms are caught in a play of differences that prevents either from being pure or self-sufficient, and recognizing this opens possibilities for rethinking identity, for questioning foundations, for challenging power structures that present themselves as natural or necessary. And this is why deconstruction has been politically controversial, why it has been embraced by some as liberatory and attacked by others as nihilistic, why it continues to generate debate about whether undermining foundations strengthens or weakens resistance to injustice. Critics argue that deconstruction is self-refuting, that if all meaning is deferred, then deconstruction itself has no stable meaning, that if presence is impossible, then Derrida cannot mean what he says, cannot expect to be understood, cannot make claims that others can grasp. But this misses the point because deconstruction does not claim that meaning is impossible, does not deny that communication works, does not embrace skepticism or relativism. It claims only that meaning is not what philosophy thought it was, is not presence but deferral, is not self-sufficient but depends on difference. And this does not prevent communication, but explains how communication is possible, explains how signs can function in the absence of their origins, how text can be understood by readers who do not know the author, how meaning can survive contexts and travel across time and space. And all of this is possible because meaning is not tied to presence, because it depends on structures that exceed any moment of presence, because difference is not a limitation, but the condition of possibility of meaning itself. Every culture sees itself as the center, as the normal, as the standard against which all others are measured. And this seeing is not perception, but is construction, is not discovery, but is projection, is the way that collective consciousness creates a mirror that reflects not what is there, but what needs to be there, what the culture needs to believe about itself in order to maintain coherence, to justify its existence, to explain why it is the way it is and why that way is right, is natural, is superior to the ways of others. And the superiority is not argued, but is assumed, is the unexamined premise that underlies all cultural self-understanding, is the narcissism that is not individual, but is collective, is the belief that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes about itself, is the myth that every nation tells, is the story that makes the culture cohere, that gives members a sense of belonging, of pride, of being part of something that matters. And the mattering is created through the mirror, through the reflection that shows not reality, but idealization. Not what is, but what is imagined. Not the truth, but the narrative. And the narrative is selective, is editing out what does not fit, is highlighting what confirms, is creating the image that the culture wants to see, needs to see, must see in order to function. And the functioning requires this distortion, requires this narcissism, because without it the culture would have to confront its ordinariness, its contingency, its lack of cosmic significance. And the lack is unbearable, is threatening to the collective sense of worth, is undermining the pride that holds the group together. And so the mirror is maintained, is polished, is defended against any reflection that might show something different, something less flattering, something true. And the truth is what the mirror hides, is what the distortion prevents, is what the narcissism protects against. Because the truth is that every culture is just one culture among many, is not special, is not chosen, is not superior, is just a particular arrangement of customs and beliefs and practices that happen to emerge in a particular place at a particular time. And that could have been otherwise. And the otherwise is what cannot be acknowledged, is what the mirror does not show, is what the myth denies, because acknowledging contingency is admitting that the culture is not necessary, is not inevitable, is not the fulfillment of destiny, but is just accident, just history, just the result of forces that have nothing to do with the culture's self-understanding. And the self-understanding is what the mirror creates, is what the myth provides, is the story that makes the culture make sense, that explains why things are the way they are, that justifies the structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities that characterize every culture. And the justification is necessary, is required, is what prevents revolution, what maintains order, what ensures that those who benefit from the arrangement continue to benefit, and those who suffer continue to accept their suffering as natural, as deserved, as the way things must be. And the must is the mythology, is the claim to necessity, is the insistence that this culture, this arrangement, this way of being is not just one way, but is the way, is the correct way, is the superior way. And the superiority is demonstrated through comparison, through the creation of the other, through the projection onto outsiders of everything that the culture rejects in itself, everything that threatens the idealized image, everything that the mirror cannot reflect without shattering. And the shattering is what must be prevented, is what the other makes possible by absorbing all the negativity, all the qualities that the culture denies having, all the characteristics that are incompatible with the myth. And the incompatible is projected outward, is placed onto foreigners, onto enemies, onto those who are different. And the difference is constructed, is exaggerated, is made to seem absolute when it is relative, is made to seem essential when it is superficial, is made to seem threatening when it is merely unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar is what the culture cannot tolerate, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge without threatening the narrative, without disturbing the reflection, without revealing that the mirror is distorting, is lying, is showing not reality, but fantasy. And the fantasy is collective, is shared, is believed, not because evidence supports it, but because the culture requires it, requires the belief that we are good, are just, are noble, are superior. And the superior is the story that every empire tells, is the myth that every dominant culture maintains, is the narrative that justifies conquest, exploitation, domination. Because if we are superior, then we have the right to rule, have the obligation to civilize, have the duty to spread our ways to those who are inferior, who are backward, who are lacking what we have. And what we have is not just wealth or technology or power, but is virtue, is morality, is the right way of being human. And the right way is our way, is the only way, is the way that must be imposed on others for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our mirror shows, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not questioned internally, is not doubted by members, is accepted as truth, as obvious as the way things are. Because the culture has been internalized, has been absorbed, has become the framework through which reality is perceived, and perception is always filtered, is always shaped by the categories that culture provides, by the concepts that language offers, by the narratives that mythology supplies, and the supply is constant, is reinforced through education, through media, through the rituals that celebrate the culture, through the symbols that represent it, through the history that is taught, and the teaching is selective, is presenting only the parts that confirm the narrative, that support the myth, that maintain the reflection, and the reflection shows heroes, shows triumphs, shows progress, shows the culture moving toward perfection, toward the realization of its values, toward the fulfillment of its destiny. And the destiny is what the myth claims, is the belief that the culture is not just existing, but is going somewhere, is fulfilling a purpose, is playing a role in a larger story. And the story is always about us, is always centered on our experience, is always presenting our perspective as the perspective, our values as the values, our way as the way. And the way is not recognized as particular, but is experienced as universal, is not seen as one option among many, but is felt as the natural, the normal, the correct. And the correct is what blindness produces, is what the mirror creates, is the inability to see that the reflection is distorted, that the image is idealized, that the narrative is selective, and the selective is what creates the blind spots, is what prevents the culture from seeing its own violence, its own exploitation, its own contradictions, because these do not fit the narrative, do not confirm the myth, do not appear in the mirror, and so they are not seen, are not acknowledged, are not integrated into the culture's self-understanding, and the understanding remains partial, remains distorted, remains narcissistic, and the narcissism is not pathological in the individual sense, but is structural, is built into the way that cultures function, is necessary for cohesion, for identity, for the maintenance of boundaries. Because without the belief that we are special, the culture would dissolve, would fragment, would lose the binding force that makes a collection of individuals into a collective. And the collective requires mythology, requires shared stories, requires the mirror that reflects not individuals, but the group, not reality, but the ideal, not what is, but what is imagined. And the imagined is powerful, is shaping behavior, is creating expectations, is defining roles, is organizing life. And the organization is not neutral, is not innocent, is serving interests, is maintaining hierarchies, is justifying inequalities. Because the mythology always benefits some more than others, always privileges certain positions, always legitimates certain arrangements. And the legitimation is what the mirror provides, is what the myth accomplishes, is the conversion of contingent social arrangements into natural necessities of historical accidents, into inevitable developments of particular values, into universal truths. And the truths are not true, but are believed, are accepted, are acted upon. And the acting upon is what makes them real, in a sense, is what gives them power, is what makes them consequential. Because collective beliefs shape collective action, shape policy, shape war, shape empire. An empire is always justified through mythology, is always presenting itself as bringing civilization, bringing progress, bringing enlightenment to those who lack it. And the lack is projected, is assumed, is what the mirror does not show about the empire itself, which is that what it brings is often destruction, is exploitation, is the imposition of its ways onto others who did not ask for them, do not want them, are harmed by them, but the harm is not seen, is not reflected in the mirror, is not part of the narrative, because the narrative is about benevolence, about mission, about the burden that the superior must bear, and the burden is the story that Kipling told, is the myth that empires use, is the claim that domination is duty, that conquest is care. That exploitation is education. And the education is the transfer of culture, is the spreading of the superior ways, is the civilizing mission that justifies everything, that makes violence noble, that makes theft righteous, that makes subjugation liberation. And the liberation is what the empire claims to bring, is what its mythology proclaims, is what its mirror reflects. And the reflection is believed not just by rulers, but by the ruled, not just by exploiters, but by the exploited, because the mythology is totalizing, is pervasive, is shaping consciousness, is providing the categories through which experience is understood. And understanding within the mythology confirms the mythology, is circular, is self-reinforcing, is making it difficult to see outside, to recognize the distortion, to notice that the mirror is lying, and the lying is not intentional, is not conspiracy, is structural, is the way that collective narcissism operates, is the inevitable result of cultures needing to see themselves as good, as just, as right. And the right is always defined by the culture itself, is always reflecting back what the culture wants to see, is never showing what the culture is afraid to see, which is its own violence, its own hypocrisy, its own contingency. And the contingency is what every national myth denies, is what every claim to exceptionalism rejects, is the recognition that this culture could have been otherwise, that its values are not universal, but are particular, that its supremacy is not deserved, but is the result of power, of conquest, of accident. And the accident is what cannot be admitted, is what the mythology covers, is what the mirror hides, because admitting accident is admitting that the culture is not special, is not chosen, is not fulfilling destiny, but is just existing, just happening, just being one arrangement among many possible arrangements. And the many is what threatens, is what the other represents, is what must be denied in order to maintain the belief that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure. And the measure is how cultures see others, is how they project onto difference. Everything they reject in themselves is how they create the barbarian, the savage, the backward, the enemy. And the enemy is necessary, is required by the mythology, is what defines the culture by contrast, is what makes us good by being bad, is what makes us civilized by being savage, is what makes us superior by being inferior. And the inferior is not discovered but is created, is constructed through the selection of differences, through the exaggeration of contrasts, through the interpretation of practices as evidence of backwardness. And the backwardness is what justifies intervention, justifies domination, justifies the spreading of our ways, because if they are backward, then they need us, need our help, need our civilization. And the civilization is what we bring, what we impose, what we force upon them for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our values dictate, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not listening, is not dialogue, is not exchange, is imposition, is violence, is the erasure of their culture in the name of bringing them ours. And the erasure is not seen as violence, but is seen as progress, is seen as liberation, is seen as the inevitable movement toward the universal, which is really the particular disguised as universal, is our particular values presented as the values, our particular ways presented as the way, our particular culture presented as culture itself. And culture itself is what we believe we are, is what the mirror shows, is what the mythology claims, that we are not just a culture, but our culture, are not just civilized, but our civilization, are not just one way of being human, but are the way, the correct way, the superior way. And the superiority is what cannot be questioned internally, is what is taboo to doubt, is what is defended violently when challenged. Because challenging the myth is challenging the culture's identity, is threatening the collective narcissism, is disturbing the mirror, and the mirror must be maintained, must be protected, must be polished, because without it the culture would have to see itself as it is, would have to confront its ordinariness, its violence, its contradictions. And the contradictions are everywhere, are visible to outsiders, are obvious to those who are not invested in the mythology, but are invisible to insiders, are not reflected in the mirror, are edited out of the narrative, are the blind spots that every culture has, that every mythology creates, that every collective narcissism requires, because seeing the contradictions would require changing, would require admitting error, would require acknowledging that the culture is not what it claims to be, is not as good as it believes, is not as just as it proclaims, and the proclaiming is constant, is part of the mythology, is the endless assertion that we are different, are better, are special, are the exception to the patterns that govern other cultures. And the exception is what every empire believes, is the myth of American exceptionalism, of British civilizing mission, of French universal values, of every dominant culture that has ever existed, each believing that it is different, that it is not like the empires that came before, that its domination is justified where others were not, that its violence is necessary where others was cruel, that its expansion is liberation where others was conquest. And the difference is illusion, is projection, is the mirror showing what the culture needs to see, which is that we are good, are noble, are doing what is right, and the right is whatever we are doing, is whatever serves our interests, is whatever maintains our power, and the power is presented as service, as burden, as duty, and the duty is what the mythology creates, is the belief that we must spread our ways, must bring our civilization, must impose our order, because without us the world would be chaos, would be darkness, would be backward, and the backward is where others are, is what defines them, is what justifies our dominance, and the dominance is not called dominance, but is called leadership, is called guidance, is called help. And the help is not asked for, is not wanted, is imposed, is forced, is the violence that the mirror does not show, that the mythology does not name, that the culture does not see, because seeing it would require shattering the mirror, would require abandoning the myth, would require confronting the collective narcissism. And the confronting is what cannot happen, is what is too threatening, is what would destroy the culture's sense of itself. And the sense of itself is what the culture is the only coherence it has, is the mythology that makes it a culture rather than just a collection of people. And so the mirror is maintained, the myth is preserved, the narcissism continues, and the culture sees itself as it needs to see itself, as special, as superior, as exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the distorted reflection that is mistaken for reality, is the mirror stage of culture where the culture is forever trapped, forever seeing the idealized image, forever believing the mythology, forever blind to the contradictions, forever projecting onto others what it cannot acknowledge in itself, forever creating the other who absorbs the negativity, who represents the threat, who justifies the violence, and the violence continues, the mythology persists, the mirror remains, and cultures continue to see themselves as the center, as the standard, as the exception, and the exception is the lie, is the delusion, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every mythology maintains, that every mirror reflects, and the reflecting is distorting, is hiding, is preventing the culture from seeing what it is, from acknowledging its contingency, from recognizing its violence, from confronting its contradictions, from shattering the mirror, from abandoning the myth, from giving up the narcissism. And the giving up is impossible, is what cultures cannot do, is what would mean their dissolution, their end, their transformation into something else. And the something else is what is feared, is what the mythology prevents, is what the mirror hides, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is the function, is what the distorted reflection accomplishes, is what makes cultures culture, is what allows collective identity, is what creates the binding force, and the force is mythology, is narrative, is the mirror that shows not truth, but need, not reality, but fantasy, not what is, but what must be believed. And the belief is collective, is shared, is the myth that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional. And the exceptional is the delusion, is the mirror stage of culture, is the permanent condition of collective consciousness, is the way that societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives. And the narratives are false, are projections, are narcissistic, and the narcissism is structural, is necessary, is what makes culture possible, is what creates cohesion, is what maintains the illusion that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure, and the measure is the mirror, is the myth, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every society maintains, that every empire believes, that every nation proclaims. And the proclaiming is the distortion, is the reflection, is the mirror stage where culture is trapped, where it sees itself not as it is, but as it needs to be, not as truth, but as mythology, not as one among many, but as the one, the exceptional, the special, the superior. And the superior is the lie, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs for itself, where it reflects its own image, where it sees only what it wants to see. And what it wants to see is that it matters, that it is right, that it is good. And the good is the reflection, is the myth, is the collective narcissism, is the mirror stage of culture where every culture is trapped, where every society remains, where every empire believes its own mythology, and the mythology is the mirror, is the distortion, is the way that cultures see themselves, as exceptional, as special, as superior. And the superior is the delusion, is the projection, is the narcissism, is the mirror stage that never ends, that continues forever, that defines culture, that creates the blind spots, that maintains the myth, that polishes the mirror, that reflects the lie. And the lie is believed, is shared, is what makes culture culture. And culture is the mirror, is the stage, is the collective narcissism, is the distorted reflection, is the mythology, is the illusion that we are exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the mirror stage of culture that shows not truth but need, not reality but fantasy, not what is but what must be seen. And the seeing is distorted, is narcissistic, is collective, is the way that cultures see themselves, forever, inevitably, necessarily, as the center, as the standard, as the exception. And the exception is the myth, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs, where it reflects, where it believes its own lies, and the lies are the culture, are the mythology, are the collective narcissism, are the mirror stage that every society inhabits, that every culture maintains, that every empire believes. And the believing is the distortion, is the reflection, is the way that cultures see themselves as exceptional when they are ordinary, as superior when they are equal, as chosen when they are contingent. And the contingent is what the mirror hides, is what the myth denies, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is permanent, is structural, is what makes the mirror stage of culture eternal, inevitable, universal. The way that all societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives that are believed, that are shared, that are maintained, that are the culture, that are the mirror, that are the stage, that are the collective narcissism that defines human social existence, that creates the blind spots, that justifies the violence, that maintains the myth, that every culture exhibits, that every society believes, that every empire proclaims. And the proclaiming is the mirror, is the stage, is the distorted reflection that is culture seeing itself. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and even then what appears in the reflection is reversed, backward, fundamentally altered by the act of observation. And this simple fact about vision contains within it a deeper truth about consciousness, about the strange recursive loop that happens when awareness tries to become aware of itself, when the mind attempts to know the mind, when the self turns inward to discover what the self actually is, and what it finds, or thinks it finds, is never quite the thing doing the finding, never quite the observer, but always the observed, always one step removed, always a representation rather than the thing itself. And this gap, this irreducible distance between the knower and the known, when both are supposedly the same entity, creates a problem that has troubled philosophers since humans first developed the capacity to ask who they are, a problem that might not have a solution because the very structure of self-knowledge contains a contradiction, a paradox built into the architecture of introspection that makes genuine self-understanding not just difficult, but perhaps logically impossible. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple at Delphi the command to know thyself, and Socrates spent his life insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of philosophy, the path to virtue. But Socrates also claimed to know nothing, claimed that his only wisdom was recognizing his ignorance, and perhaps these two positions are connected. Perhaps the examination of the self leads inevitably to the discovery that the self cannot be known, that the more carefully one looks inward, the more elusive the thing being sought becomes, like trying to grasp water or catch one's own shadow. And this elusiveness is not an accident, not a failure of attention or effort, but something essential to what consciousness is, something about how the mind works that makes it constitutively opaque to itself, forever mysterious, forever strange. When someone sits quietly and tries to observe their own thoughts, tries to watch the mind in action, something peculiar happens. The thoughts change. They become different thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, thoughts about thinking, and the original spontaneous flow of mental activity that was supposed to be observed has already been altered by the act of observation, has been replaced by a different kind of mental activity, the activity of observing. And this is the observer effect in consciousness, borrowed from quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes what is being measured, where particles behave differently when watched. And though the analogy is imperfect, though consciousness is not exactly like quantum systems, there is something similar happening, something about awareness that transforms its object, that cannot leave things as they are. And this means that introspection is never neutral, never a clear window onto the mind, but always an intervention, always a distortion. And what is seen in introspection is not the mind as it normally operates, but the mind as it operates when being observed, which is a different mind, a mind in a different state, performing a different function. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the introspection illusion, the false belief that people have direct access to their mental processes, that they can simply look inward and discover why they feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe, why they did what they did. But decades of research in cognitive psychology show that introspection is unreliable, that people confidently report reasons for their behavior that are simply wrong, that they confabulate explanations without realizing they are confabulating, that the mind generates plausible sounding stories about itself, but these stories are not reports from the inside, are not transcripts of actual mental processes, but rather are post hoc rationalizations, narratives constructed after the fact to make sense of actions that were caused by processes the conscious mind never had access to in the first place. In one famous experiment, researchers showed people photographs and asked them to choose which face they found more attractive. And after the choice was made, the researchers used sleight of hand to swap the photographs, showing people the face they did not choose and asking them to explain why they chose it. And the majority of people did not notice the switch, did not realize they were explaining a choice they never made, and they generated detailed explanations, talked about the eyes, the smile, the overall impression, completely convinced they were reporting genuine introspective insights, when in fact they were making up reasons, on the spot, confabulating freely. And this was not lying, was not intentional deception, because the people genuinely believed their own explanations, genuinely felt they were accurately describing their mental processes. But they were not, they were creating a story. And this is what introspection often is, not discovery, but creation, not observation, but fabrication. And the frightening part is that it feels identical from the inside. There is no phenomenological difference between genuine self-knowledge and convincing self-deception. No way to tell, just by introspecting, whether the reasons being accessed are real or invented, whether the self-understanding being achieved is accurate or illusory. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued against what he called the ghost in the machine, against the Cartesian idea that there is an inner mental theatre where a homunculus, a little person inside the head, watches experiences unfold on a screen. And Ryle pointed out that this model leads to infinite regress, because if there is a homunculus watching the screen, then what is watching the homunculus? What is aware of the awareness? And this question repeats indefinitely, creating an infinite stack of observers, which is absurd, which suggests the model is wrong, that consciousness is not structured like a theatre with an audience, that there is no central viewing point, no little self inside observing the big self. But if this is true, if there is no homunculus, then what is introspection? What is happening when it feels like the self is observing itself? And the answer might be that nothing is being observed, that introspection is a kind of cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays, a way of accessing some information about its own state, but mistaking this limited, partial access for complete transparency, for total self-knowledge, when really most of what the brain does is hidden, is unconscious, is inaccessible to the part that thinks it is doing the knowing. Freud built an entire therapeutic method on the premise that the self is largely unknown to itself, that beneath the conscious mind lies the unconscious, vast and dark and full of repressed desires, traumatic memories, primitive drives, and that the work of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to achieve insight. And for Freud, insight was curative. Knowing why you are anxious or depressed or behaving strangely would dissolve the symptom, would free you from the tyranny of forces you did not understand. But the history of psychoanalysis is also a history of people discovering things about themselves that they do not recognize, that feel foreign, that seem like they must belong to someone else. And the analyst says, "This is you. This desire, this rage, this fear." And the patient says, "No, that is not me. I do not feel that way." And the analyst says, "You are resisting. You are defending against the truth." And maybe the analyst is right. Maybe resistance is real. But maybe also the patient is right. Maybe what the analyst is finding through interpretation is not the hidden self, but another construct, another story, not more true than the patient's own story, just differently structured. And the question becomes, whose interpretation counts as knowledge? Who gets to say what the self really is when the self being analysed does not recognise itself in the analysis? Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, took a different approach, argued that the therapist should not interpret, should not claim to know the client better than the client knows themselves, but should rather create conditions where the client can explore their own experience, can come to their own understanding. And Rogers believed that people have an innate capacity for self-awareness, that given the right environment of empathy and unconditional, positive regard, the true self would emerge. But even Rogers noticed something strange, noticed that people in therapy often encountered aspects of themselves that surprised them, that contradicted their self-concept, that felt like meeting a stranger. And sometimes this stranger was more real than the familiar self. Sometimes the person they thought they were turned out to be a performance, a mask, a role they had been playing for so long they forgot it was a role. And the therapeutic process was not discovering the self, but discovering that the self they thought they knew was a fiction. And underneath that fiction was not another, more authentic self, but just more layers, more complexity, more contradictions that resist integration into a single, coherent narrative. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the hermeneutics of suspicion, about thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who taught that consciousness is false consciousness, that what people believe about themselves is ideology or rationalization or symptom, that the surface meaning is never the real meaning, that everything must be interpreted, decoded, suspected, and Ricoeur saw this as both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because people do deceive themselves, do operate under illusions, but dangerous because it leads to a paranoid style of thinking where nothing is taken at face value, where every claim to self-knowledge is dismissed as naive, where the expert, the analyst, the critical theorist always knows better than the person living the life. And this dynamic is a power dynamic, is a way of invalidating someone's experience, of saying, you do not know yourself, but I know you. And Ricoeur tried to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with a hermeneutics of trust, try to preserve the possibility that people sometimes do know themselves, that introspection sometimes does reveal genuine truths. But even he could not escape the problem that the self who is trusting their own introspection might be the one most deceived, might be the one who needs suspicion the most. And so the circle closes. The paradox remains: how to know whether you know yourself when the instrument of knowing is the same instrument being examined, when the eye trying to see itself has no independent vantage point, no place to stand outside the system. Neuroscience has added new dimensions to this problem, has shown that the brain is not a unified system, but a collection of subsystems, modules, networks that often operate independently, sometimes in conflict, and that what is experienced as the self, as the unified conscious agent, is really a construct, an emergent property, a story the brain tells about the activity of its parts. And this story is useful, helps coordinate behavior, helps navigate social environments, but it is not an accurate map of the underlying territory, not a faithful representation of how the brain actually works. And the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat epilepsy. And in these patients, the two hemispheres can be shown different information, can be asked to perform different tasks. And what Gazzaniga found is that the left hemisphere, the one responsible for language, will confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, will create stories to explain behavior it did not cause and does not understand. And the patient is not aware of confabulating, genuinely believes the explanations, and Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere the interpreter, argues that one of its primary functions is to generate a coherent narrative of the self, to make sense of the chaos of neural activity, to create the illusion of unity and purpose and understanding. And if the left hemisphere does this in split-brain patients, it is likely doing it in everyone, all the time, constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly constructing a self that feels real but might be mostly fiction. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, that what is called the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and sensations, and perceptions, and mental formations, and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, never stable, never autonomous, always conditioned by causes beyond their control. And the belief in a permanent, independent self is the root of suffering, is what causes attachment and aversion. And the path to liberation is to see through this illusion, to experience directly the absence of self, the emptiness. And this teaching is not theoretical, but experiential, is something that advanced meditators report encountering: the dissolution of the sense of self, the realization that there is no one home, no center, no observer, just experience arising and passing. And Western scientists studying meditation have found that certain practices do alter brain activity in regions associated with self-reference, do reduce the default mode network that activates when people are thinking about themselves. And some meditators describe this as liberating, as a relief, as finally seeing clearly, but others find it terrifying, find that the loss of self feels like annihilation, like death. And the question is whether what the meditators are discovering is the truth about the self, or just another state of consciousness, just a different way of experiencing, and whether there is any way to know which interpretation is correct, whether the self that feels so solid in ordinary consciousness is the illusion, or whether the no self experienced in deep meditation is the illusion, or whether both are valid descriptions of different aspects of the same underlying reality that cannot be captured completely by either framework. David Hume in the 18th century tried to find the self through introspection, tried to locate the I that supposedly unifies experience, and he reported that he could never find it, that when he looked inward, all he found were particular perceptions, particular thoughts and feelings and sensations, but never the self that was supposedly having these perceptions, never the subject separate from the objects of consciousness. And Hume concluded that the self is a fiction, a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but not by any underlying substance. And this conclusion disturbed him. He admitted that his skepticism about the self led to a kind of philosophical melancholy, a sense of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. But even as he doubted the existence of the self, he continued to use the first person, continued to say, I think, I feel, I conclude. And this tension, this inability to live, according to the implications of the philosophy, shows how deeply the sense of self is embedded, how resistant it is to intellectual dissolution. And perhaps this is because the self is not a thing to be found through introspection, but a process, a doing rather than a being, the activity of organizing experience rather than an entity that exists independently of that activity. And if this is true, then looking for the self is like trying to find the dance apart from the dancing, trying to locate the song separate from the singing, and the failure to find it does not prove. It does not exist, but rather proves that the question is malformed, that existence is the wrong category, that the self is not the kind of thing that can be observed because it is the observing, not the object, but the act. And this shift in framing does not solve the problem, but relocates it, makes the question not whether the self exists, but what kind of thing it is, what kind of existence it has, and whether this kind of existence is compatible with self-knowledge, or whether self-knowledge in the traditional sense, knowledge of an object by a subject, is structurally impossible when subject and object are the same. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the what it is likeness of experience, and access consciousness, the information available for use in reasoning and report, and they note that these can come apart, that there might be experiences that feel like something but cannot be accessed, cannot be reported, cannot be known by the person having them. And this suggests that consciousness is not transparent to itself, that there are aspects of subjective experience that are hidden even from the subject. And if this is true, then the project of self-knowledge faces an even deeper obstacle. Not just the problem of the observer effect or confabulation, but the problem that some of what the self is, some of what makes experience what it is in principle inaccessible, is locked away in a part of consciousness that has no connection to the part that can reflect and report. And this inaccessible region might be small, or it might be vast, might be a minor footnote to consciousness, or might be the bulk of it. And there is no way to know, because by definition, it cannot be known, cannot be brought into awareness. And so, self-knowledge, even in the best case, is always partial, always incomplete, always missing something essential that remains forever in darkness. The question then becomes not whether complete self-knowledge is possible, because it is not, but whether partial self-knowledge is worth pursuing, whether the fragments of understanding that can be achieved through introspection and therapy and meditation and neuroscience are valuable, even if they are fragments, even if they do not add up to a complete picture. And the answer might be yes, might be that partial knowledge is better than none, that understanding some of the forces shaping thought and behaviour is better than understanding nothing, that the attempt to know the self, even if it cannot fully succeed, makes life more deliberate, more examined, more awake, and this is what Socrates might have meant. Not that self-knowledge is achievable, but that the examination is valuable, that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept the surface, the insistence on looking deeper, even when the depths remain murky, is what distinguishes a life worth living from a life lived in automaticity, in habit, in the sleep of unexamined assumption. And perhaps the paradox of self-knowledge is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be inhabited, a recognition that the self is always both knower and unknown, always both transparent and opaque, always both intimate and strange, and that this dual nature is not a bug but a feature, not a limitation, but the condition of being the kind of creature that can ask who it is, that can turn awareness back on itself even if the turn is never complete, even if the circle never closes, even if the eye can never fully see itself, and must remain forever partially blind to its own nature.